a black waitress. Her fingers gripped the wrist of a CEO.
Sir,
The pen was only
don't
2 inches
sign.
from the signature.
What are you
$200 million
doing?
in a single stroke.
please don't sign.
The security guard pushed her.
Get your filthy black hands off him! Animals aren't allowed to touch guests! Who gave this cockroach permission to get near my desk? You stink. You're nothing. You're not allowed to breathe near people like us. Drag her out! You're fired!
I don't care.
Hannah leaned close to Garrett Ellison's ear and whispered.
Page
4
12.
seconds. His
Section
face turned
C.
pale. His
company
fingers
becomes
snapped
his.
open. The pen fell, rolling across the contract,
He's taking
leaving an ink
everything.
stain on page 12. Those 4 words made Garrett realize that everything in that room had changed, for good. 12 hours earlier. The alarm buzzed at 5:40. Not the sharp digital kind, the old wind-up type that rattled on the nightstand like something trying to escape. Hannah Irving reached across the dark and slapped it quiet. The apartment was small. 1 bedroom in the South Bronx, 3rd floor, radiator that clanked but never heated. She'd taped a blanket over the window last winter. It was still there. She swung her legs off the mattress and sat for a moment, listening. Down the hall, behind a door covered in butterfly stickers, her daughter Lily slept, 4 years old, breathing soft and even. Hannah moved through the kitchen without turning on the light. She knew every step. Coffee first, the cheap instant kind, 2 spoonfuls, water from the tap because the kettle took too long. She ate a granola bar standing at the counter, staring at nothing. By 6:15 she was dressed. White shirt, black pants, slip-resistant shoes worn thin at the heels. She kissed Lily's forehead without waking her and left the keys for Mrs. Patterson next door, who watched Lily until the after-school program started. The bus came at 6:32. Same stop, same driver, same cracked vinyl seat behind the door. Manhattan unfolded through the window like a movie she wasn't cast in. Glass towers caught the early light. Town cars glided past. A woman in a cashmere coat walked a dog that probably ate better than most people on this bus. Hannah watched it all with a face that gave away nothing. She'd learned that early. Keep your eyes open. Keep your mouth closed. The city rewarded people who didn't ask for too much. The diner sat on the corner of 10th Avenue. Nikki's. Open since 1987. She worked breakfast and lunch there, 5 days a week. $3 tips on $6 eggs. Her hands smelled like bacon grease by noon. The regulars knew her name. The owner didn't. She was good at the job. Not good in the way people notice. Good in the way that keeps everything from falling apart. She remembered orders without writing them down. She refilled coffee before anyone asked. She smiled even when her feet burned and her back seized up between her shoulder blades. The lunch rush ended at 2. Hannah counted her tips in the break room. $41.60. She folded the bills into her wallet, zipped it shut, and caught the crosstown bus. Le Maison d'Or was a different planet. Crystal chandeliers, linen napkins pressed into swans, wine lists thicker than textbooks. The kind of restaurant where the bread alone cost more than Hannah's hourly wage. She worked evenings there, 4 nights a week. The pay was better. The tips could be extraordinary, but only if you were invisible. The best servers at Le Maison d'Or were the ones guests never quite remembered. Hannah was perfect at being invisible. She'd had years of practice. She arrived at 4:30 and changed into her uniform in the staff room. Black dress, white apron, hair pinned back. Chef Moreau barked at her before she finished tying the apron strings. "Irving, the fennel. You prepped it wrong yesterday." She hadn't. She knew she hadn't, but she nodded. "Yes, chef. I'll fix it." That was the trick. Don't argue. Don't explain. Don't waste energy on battles that cost more than they're worth. At 5 o'clock, the head server called the pre-shift meeting. "Tonight's VIP reservation. Private dining room. Party of 6. High-profile corporate event," he said, reading from the book. "The guest has requested absolute discretion." Hannah was assigned to the room. She spent the next hour setting it up. Each fork measured 3 centimeters from the table edge. Each glass polished until her fingerprints vanished. each napkin folded into a precise cathedral shape, 12 creases, perfectly symmetrical. She stepped back and checked the room. Then she checked it again. Every detail mattered in a room like this. One wrinkle in the linen, one water spot on a glass, and someone would notice. Someone always noticed. This was something people never understood about Hannah Irving. The same instinct that made her align silverware to the millimeter. That same instinct made her read every supplier invoice twice, every lease renewal, every insurance form, because she knew what happened when you didn't. She straightened one last fork, a quarter turned to the right, and walked back to the kitchen. The VIP guests would arrive in 2 hours. Hannah Irving had no idea that the most important moment of her life was already sitting in a black leather briefcase, tucked between pages 7 and 12. The call came during her break between jobs. Hannah was sitting on a bench outside the diner, unlacing her left shoe to give her swollen foot a minute of relief, when her phone buzzed. The number belonged to Greenfield Senior Living in Queens. She knew what it meant before she answered. "Miss Irving, this is Carol from billing. Your mother's account is 62 days past due. I'm calling as a courtesy before we escalate." Hannah closed her eyes. "How much?" $4,800. "We'll need at least a partial payment by Friday, or we'll have to begin the discharge process." "I'll figure it out." She hung up and stared at the sidewalk. $4,800. She made $11.50 an hour at the diner, $14 at La Maison d'Or before tips. She did the math without trying. The math was always running in her head, and it never came out right. Her mother, Dorothy, had been at Greenfield for 2 years now. Early onset dementia. Some days she remembered Hannah's name. Most days she didn't. But Dorothy Irving hadn't always been like this. 3 years ago, she'd been sharp, quick with numbers, proud of the house she'd owned for 26 years on a quiet street in Jamaica, Queens. The house where Hannah grew up. The house with the lemon tree in the backyard that never produced lemons, but Dorothy refused to cut down. Then the financial advisor came. His name was Gerald Strauss. He wore a blue tie and carried a leather folder. He sat at Dorothy's kitchen table and explained that refinancing the mortgage would lower her monthly payments by $300. He had charts. He had projections. He had a warm smile and a patient voice. He also had a contract with a subordination clause buried on page 9 of an 11-page addendum. Dorothy signed. She didn't read page 9. She didn't know what a subordination clause was. She trusted the man with the blue tie because he reminded her of the bank manager she'd known for 30 years. Within 6 months, the clause activated. Dorothy's property became collateral for a separate debt held by a shell entity connected to Strauss's firm. When that entity defaulted, which it was designed to do, the house transferred. Legally, quietly, completely. Dorothy lost her home on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she couldn't remember where she'd put her shoes. Hannah was 25 then, junior year at NYU, studying finance on a merit scholarship. Dean's List. 3 semesters from graduation. She had a professor named Dr. Aldridge who once told her she had the sharpest eye for detail he'd seen in 15 years of teaching. None of that mattered when the bills arrived. Hannah withdrew from NYU on a Friday afternoon in October. She walked out of the registrar's office with a manila folder full of forms that said leave of absence, but meant not coming back. She took the subway home and started looking for work. But first, she sat at her mother's old kitchen table, the one from the house they no longer owned, and read Gerald Strauss's contract. Every page, every clause, every footnote. She read it the way a surgeon studies an autopsy, not to save the patient. The patient was already gone. She read it to understand exactly how the blade had entered, how deep it had cut, and where the person holding it had learned to aim. Page 9, Section D, the subordination clause. 14 lines of legal language designed to look routine, each phrase ordinary on its own. Together, they formed a trapdoor. Hannah memorized the structure, not because she wanted to, because she couldn't stop. She read other contracts after that, lease agreements, insurance policies, the fine print on her phone plan. She read the supplier invoices at the diner and found a billing error that had been costing Nikki $200 a month for 3 years. She never told anyone how she learned to read like that. It wasn't a skill she was proud of. It was a scar that happened to be useful. Now she sat on that bench, phone in her hand, shoe unlaced, doing math that didn't add up. $4,800, rent due Friday, Lily's daycare, the electric bill she'd been ignoring. She laced her shoe, stood up, and walked to the bus stop. Le Maison d'Or opened in 90 minutes. There was a VIP table tonight. Good tips, maybe. She had no way of knowing that the contract sitting in that private dining room had been built by the same blueprint as the one that had destroyed her family. The exact same blueprint, page for page. The first car arrived at 7:02, a black Escalade, tinted windows. Hannah watched from the service corridor as the maitre d' straightened his jacket and walked toward the entrance. She smoothed her apron and picked up the water pitcher. Garrett Ellison came through the door like a man who owned rooms without needing to announce it. Tall, silver-haired, a charcoal suit that fit like it had been cut while he was breathing. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way people move when they've earned the right to take their time. He stopped at the entrance to the private dining room and looked at Hannah. "Good evening," he said, and then, reading her name tag, "Hannah, thank you for taking care of us tonight." She almost dropped the pitcher. Guests at Le Maison d'Or didn't read name tags. They didn't say thank you. Most of them looked through her like she was part of the wallpaper. "Of course, sir. Welcome." Behind Garrett came Victor Caldwell, same height but sharper, a navy suit with a pocket square folded into a precise triangle. His smile arrived before he did, wide, practiced, the kind of smile that made you feel included while telling you nothing. He didn't look at Hannah at all. 2 lawyers followed, gray suits, leather briefcases, the quiet confidence of men who billed by the quarter hour. Behind them, an assistant carrying a slim black folder. The party settled into the private room. Hannah poured water. She set down the menus. She moved around the table the way she'd been trained. Efficient, silent, present only when needed. The wine order came first. A 2016 Chateau Margaux. She didn't know the price. She didn't need to. The way Victor handled the bottle, turning the label toward Garrett, nodding at the vintage, told her everything about who was performing for whom. She poured. She stepped back. She listened. Not on purpose, not at first. But the room was small, and these men spoke like she wasn't there. "This is historic, Garrett." Victor raised his glass. 2 decades of building Ellison dynamics, and tonight, we take it to the next level. 200 million, one of the lawyers said, almost to himself. Largest single acquisition in the firm's history. Garrett nodded, but his eyes stayed on Victor. "And the contract? Everything structured the way we discussed?" Victor didn't blink. "Exactly as we discussed, page by page. My team and your team reviewed every clause. The liability provisions. Handled." Victor waved a hand. "Section 8, standard indemnification. Nothing unusual." Hannah set down the bread basket. Her fingers lingered on the table for half a second longer than they should have. She noticed the way Victor's answer had arrived too fast, too smooth, like a door closing before anyone could look inside. Garrett leaned back in his chair. He swirled his wine and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then he smiled. "You know what I keep thinking about? When I started this company, I had 11 employees and a lease I couldn't afford. My wife told me I was crazy." He laughed softly. She was probably right. "And now look," Victor said, "an empire." "Not an empire, a promise. I built this thing so it would outlast me." Hannah cleared the bread plates. She moved to the sideboard and arranged the next course. But her hands had gone still for just a moment when she heard him say that. A promise. Something built to outlast the builder. She knew what it felt like to watch a promise get stolen. The appetizers arrived. Hannah carried them to the table. And on the table, next to Victor's wine glass, sat the contract. Open. Face up. 46 pages, spiral bound in black. Hannah set down the plates. Her eyes moved across the page. She couldn't help it. It started with a glance. Nothing more. Hannah was lifting the appetizer plates, the seared scallops barely touched on Victor's side, when her eyes drifted to the open contract on the table. Page 7. She didn't mean to read it. Her hands were full. She was doing her job, but her brain was faster than her hands. 3 words caught her like a hook in the chest. Subsidiary transfer provisions. She set the plates on the tray. Her fingers were steady. Her pulse was not. Subsidiary transfer provisions. She'd seen that phrase before, not in a textbook, not in a lecture, in the contract that took her mother's house. Page 9, Section D. Gerald Strauss's masterpiece. She carried the plates to the kitchen and set them down on the pass. Chef Moreau was shouting about the timing on table 12. Someone had dropped a ramekin. The kitchen was loud and hot, and nobody was looking at Hannah. She stood at the dishwashing station and pressed her palms flat against the steel counter. Cold metal. Deep breath. It could be nothing, she told herself. Subsidiary transfer provisions is standard language. It shows up in 100 different kinds of contracts. It doesn't mean what you think it means. But it did. She knew it did. The way a burn victim knows the smell of smoke. She picked up the water pitcher and walked back to the private dining room. The second course was being served. Filet mignon for Garrett, Dover sole for Victor. The lawyers had ordered the lamb. Hannah moved around the table, refilling glasses, clearing crumbs with a silver brush. Invisible work. Important work. Work that kept her within arm's reach of page 7. She positioned herself at the sideboard, arranging the dessert forks. From this angle, she could see the contract's left margin. Victor had placed his wine glass on the corner of the document, pinning it open. Page 7. She read it again, slowly this time. The clause established a subsidiary entity, referred to only as acquiring vehicle, authorized to hold assets transferred under the terms of the agreement. Standard language, ordinary phrasing, the kind of clause a tired lawyer might skim past at 11 o'clock at night. But Hannah wasn't a tired lawyer. She was a woman who had memorized the architecture of a trapdoor. She needed to see the addendum. The main course plates came and went. Hannah served, cleared, poured, stepped back. She watched Victor laugh at Garrett's stories. She watched Victor refill Garrett's glass before it was empty. She watched Victor's hand rest casually on top of the contract, fingers spread wide, like a man keeping a lid on something. 45 minutes passed. Dessert arrived, a chocolate soufflé that had to be served within 60 seconds of leaving the oven. Hannah carried it to the table herself. As she leaned forward to set the plate in front of Garrett, the contract shifted. Victor had moved his hand to accept his own dessert. The pages fanned open, pages 11 and 12. The addendum. Hannah's eyes locked on the text. She had maybe 4 seconds before someone noticed. 4 seconds was enough. Section C, third paragraph. The subordination clause. 14 lines of language that looked routine if you read them in isolation. Language that said the primary assets described in sections 4 through 8 would serve as collateral for obligations incurred by the acquiring vehicle, which, upon execution of the agreement, would assume operational authority over the consolidated entity. Translation. The moment Garrett signed, his company would become collateral for a debt held by the subsidiary, and the subsidiary would take control. Hannah's hands didn't shake this time. They went still, completely, terrifyingly still. She looked at the bottom of page 12, a footnote, small type. The subsidiary's registered name, Caldwell Meridian Holdings, LLC. Caldwell. Victor's name. His company. His trapdoor. Hannah set down the soufflé and stepped back. She folded her hands in front of her apron, the way she'd been trained. Composed. Professional. The model server. Inside, everything was on fire. She knew exactly what she was looking at. Not because she'd studied it in school, though she had, before school was taken from her too. She knew because this was the same machine, the same gears, the same blade, aimed at a different throat. Gerald Strauss had used a refinancing agreement to steal a house in Queens. Victor Caldwell was using a merger agreement to steal a $200 million company. Different scale, same architecture, same lie dressed in different clothes. If Garrett Ellison signed that contract tonight, he wouldn't just lose a deal. He'd lose controlling interest in the company he'd built from nothing. The company he'd called a promise. The thing he'd built to outlast himself. And he had no idea. Hannah walked back to the kitchen. She pushed through the swinging door and stood next to the walk-in cooler, where the air was cold enough to sting her eyes. Her hands were shaking now. Not from fear, from recognition. From the weight of knowing something that nobody else in that room knew. Something that could change everything, or nothing, depending on what she did in the next 30 minutes. She thought about the math. $11.50 an hour at the diner, $14 at Le Maison d'Or, $41.60 in tips today, $4,800 owed to Greenfield, rent on Friday. If she said something, she would lose this job. Not might, would. A waitress who interrupts a $200 million signing ceremony doesn't get a warning. She gets escorted out. And then what? No Le Maison d'Or. No evening tips. No way to make the payment. Her mother discharged from the facility. Lily without daycare. She pressed her back against the cooler door and closed her eyes. "It's not your problem," the practical voice said. "You don't know these people. You owe them nothing. Walk back in, serve the coffee, collect your tip, and go home." The practical voice was right. It was almost always right. But Hannah Irving had spent 3 years reading contracts because she couldn't stop. Because once you see the blade, you can't unsee it. Because the woman who signed the paper that took her home had trusted a man with a warm smile, and nobody, not a single person, had told her to stop. Hannah opened her eyes. She didn't have an answer yet, but she had a question that wouldn't let her go. If someone had been there for your mother, if someone had grabbed her hand and said, "Don't sign," would you still be standing here? She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist and straightened her apron. The champagne course was next. Victor had ordered a bottle of Dom Perignon for the toast. The toast that would come right before the signature. Hannah pulled the Dom Perignon from the ice bucket and dried the bottle with a linen cloth. Her hands moved on autopilot. Twist the cage, hold the cork, ease it out with a whisper, not a pop. Le Maison d'Or servers didn't pop champagne, they released it. She set 6 flutes on a silver tray. The crystal caught the kitchen light and scattered it across the ceiling in small, nervous shapes. "Don't do it." The voice in her head was calm and specific. It spoke in numbers. $14 an hour. 4 nights a week, $224 before tips. Lose this job, and you lose the only thing standing between Lily and an eviction notice, between your mother and a discharge letter, between you and the kind of poverty that doesn't let you back up. She arranged the flutes in a perfect circle on the tray. 6 stems, 6 chances to keep her mouth shut and walk away with her paycheck. He has lawyers. He has advisors. He has a board of directors. If they didn't catch it, that's their problem. You're a waitress. This is not your table. She picked up the tray and pushed through the kitchen door. The hallway to the private room was dim. Soft lighting, neutral carpet, framed photographs of wine country on the walls. And standing at the far end, one hand in his pocket and a phone pressed to his ear, was Garrett Ellison. He wasn't talking business. His voice had changed. Softer, higher. The voice of a man speaking to someone very small and very important. "I know, sweetheart. Grandpa's almost done. I'll bring you something special. Yes, I promise." A pause, a laugh. "Grandpa built this whole thing for you, you know that? All of it. Every piece." He hung up and stood there for a moment, looking at the phone. Then he slipped it into his pocket and walked back into the dining room. Hannah didn't move. She stood in the hallway, holding 6 glasses of champagne, and felt something shift inside her chest, like a key turning in a lock. Dorothy Irving had signed a contract because she trusted someone. Nobody stopped her. Hannah looked at the tray. She looked at the dining room door. Then she walked through it. Hannah set the champagne flutes on the table, one for each guest. She poured the Dom Perignon with the steady hand of a woman who had decided something and wasn't going to undecide it. Victor stood up. "Gentlemen," he lifted his glass. 15 years ago, Garrett Ellison took a chance on a partnership that everyone said was too risky. Tonight, we make that partnership permanent, to Ellison Dynamics and to the next chapter. The glasses clinked. Hannah stepped back to the sideboard. Garrett took a small sip, set his glass down, and looked around the table. "I want to say something before we do this." His voice was quiet. The room leaned in. "I started this company with nothing, a rented office and a phone that didn't ring for the first 3 months. My wife thought I'd lost my mind. My accountant told me to quit." He paused. "But I believed in something. I believed that if you build something honest, something real, it holds. It stands." He looked at Victor. "You've been part of that, Vic. 15 years, and tonight we make it official." Victor nodded. His smile was immaculate. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a pen. A Mont Blanc Meisterstück, black resin, gold trim. He placed it on the table beside the contract with the care of a man presenting a weapon. "Whenever you're ready." Garrett picked up the pen. He flipped to the last page, page 46. The signature line was printed in bold at the bottom, with his name typed beneath it in 12-point font. He leaned forward. The tip of the pen descended toward the paper. Slowly. The way a hand moves when it knows the weight of what it's about to do. 2 inches, maybe less. And then a hand that didn't belong there crossed the white tablecloth and closed around his wrist. Not hard, not violent, but firm. Certain. The grip of someone who understood that the next 2 seconds would determine everything. Hannah Irving held the CEO's wrist and did not let go. The room stopped. Not quieted. Stopped. The kind of silence that lives inside a held breath. The candles on the table didn't flicker. The ice in the water glasses didn't shift. Even the air seemed to thicken, pressing down on every surface like a hand holding the world in place. Victor's champagne glass was halfway to his mouth. It froze there. One of the lawyers had been reaching for his briefcase. His hand hung in the air. The second lawyer looked from Hannah's hand to Garrett's face and back again, his mouth forming a question he couldn't find words for. The assistant looked up from her phone with her lips parted, and Garrett Ellison stared at the hand on his wrist. A black woman's hand, the hand of his waitress, with an expression that wasn't anger, it was confusion. The deep, genuine confusion of a man who cannot understand what is happening to him. "Sir," Hannah's voice was low, controlled, not a whisper yet. "Please, don't sign." Victor's chair scraped back. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice cut across the table like a blade. "Take your hand off him! Now!" The restaurant manager appeared in the doorway, white-faced. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Ellison. This is never... Get her out of here." Victor's finger stabbed the air toward Hannah. "Get this woman out of my sight." The manager reached for Hannah's arm. "You're done. You're fired. Come with me." Hannah didn't move. She didn't look at Victor. She didn't look at the manager. She looked at Garrett Ellison, who was still holding the pen, still leaning forward, still frozen in the posture of a man about to sign his name. She leaned close to his ear, close enough to smell the Chateau Margaux on his breath, close enough that no one else in the room could hear what she said. And she whispered. Page 12, Section C. The subordination clause transfers your controlling interest to Caldwell Meridian Holdings. The moment you sign, your company belongs to him. She paused. 1 heartbeat. "It's the same trick that took my family's home." Garrett didn't move for 3 seconds. 3 seconds that felt like a crack opening in the floor of the room. The lawyers watched his face and saw something they'd never seen before. Doubt. Not the polite, strategic doubt of a negotiation. The raw, physical doubt of a man who has just been told the bridge he's standing on is missing a span. Then his eyes dropped to the contract. Page 46. He flipped backward. Page 12. His eyes moved across the text, not reading it, not yet, but seeing it for the first time the way Hannah had taught herself to see it. Not as language, as architecture. His fingers loosened around the Mont Blanc. The pen slipped. It hit the table, rolled across the contract, and left a thin black line of ink across page 12, section C. A scar on the paper that matched the one it was designed to leave on his life. Victor's face changed. Not all at once. It happened in layers. The smile went first, then the charm, then the calm. What was left underneath was something Hannah recognized. The face of a man who has been caught and is calculating how fast he can run. Garrett. Victor's voice shifted into something warm and reasonable. Come on, she's a waitress. She doesn't understand what she's looking at. This is a $200 million merger agreement. You think a restaurant server can read this? Garrett looked at Victor. Then he looked at Hannah, standing in her black uniform and white apron, her hand still resting near his wrist. The two lawyers sat motionless, watching their client's face the way sailors watch the sky before a storm. She just did, Garrett said quietly. He set the pen down, deliberately, like a man putting down a loaded gun. Nobody leaves this room. Garrett's voice had changed. It was the voice from the phone call in the hallway, the one that protected the things he'd built. But harder now, colder. The voice of a man who has just discovered the knife was already at his throat. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. Patricia, I need Sterling at La Maison d'Or in 20 minutes. Tell him to bring everything on the Caldwell file. Everything. He hung up and looked at Victor. Victor was already standing. His hand was on his briefcase. Sit down, Vic. The two men stared at each other across a table covered in crystal and champagne and a contract with an ink scar running through the heart of it. Victor sat down. The security guard at the door, Garrett's personal detail, a man the size of a refrigerator who had been standing so still he'd become furniture, shifted his weight and blocked the exit. Nobody was going anywhere. Sterling arrived in 18 minutes. Howard Sterling was Garrett's personal attorney, not the corporate team. Those were the men already sitting at the table, the ones who had reviewed the contract and missed the blade hidden inside it. Sterling was the one Garrett called when things went wrong, the one who didn't bill by the quarter hour because he was on retainer for exactly this kind of night. He walked into the private dining room carrying a leather bag and wearing the expression of a man who had been pulled from dinner with his wife. He looked at the table. He looked at Victor, sitting rigid in his chair. He looked at Hannah, standing by the sideboard in her black dress and white apron. Tell me, he said to Garrett. Her. Garrett pointed at Hannah. She'll tell you. Sterling turned to face the waitress. He didn't speak. He didn't sit down. He waited. Hannah felt the weight of every eye in the room. The two corporate lawyers, embarrassed and afraid. The assistant, her phone now face down on the table. Victor, whose jaw hadn't unclenched since the pen dropped. Garrett, who watched her the way a man watches a surgeon before the first cut. She took a breath. Then she walked to the table. May I? She gestured toward the contract. Sterling nodded. Hannah opened to page 7. Her finger traced the relevant paragraph. Here, section 4.3, subsidiary transfer provisions. This clause establishes an entity called the acquiring vehicle, authorized to hold transferred assets. On its own, it reads as boilerplate. Most merger agreements include something similar. She flipped to page 12. But here, Section C of the addendum, the subordination clause links the primary assets described in sections 4 through 8 to obligations held by the acquiring vehicle, meaning Ellison Dynamics itself becomes collateral. Sterling leaned over her shoulder. His eyes moved fast. She could hear his breathing change. And here, Hannah pointed to a footnote at the bottom of page 12. Small type, easy to miss. The acquiring vehicle's registered name, Caldwell Meridian Holdings, LLC. Sterling straightened up. His face had gone the color of old paper. Caldwell, he said. He wasn't asking. It was registered 6 months ago, Hannah continued. If Mr. Ellison had signed tonight, the execution of the agreement would have activated the subordination clause. Controlling interest would have transferred to the acquiring vehicle, to Mr. Caldwell's company. The room was silent. One of the corporate lawyers had his head in his hands. The other was already reading page 12, his lips moving without sound. Sterling looked at Garrett. She's right. 2 words. The heaviest 2 words in the room. Victor moved for the first time. He shifted forward in his chair, and when he spoke, his voice was velvet, warm, reasonable. The voice of a man who has talked his way out of rooms before. Howard, come on. This is clearly a drafting error. My legal team prepared this document, and I assure you, a drafting error that names your personal holding company? Sterling didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Victor changed tacks. Garrett, look at me. 15 years. We built this together. You're going to take the word of a waitress? A woman who serves bread for a living? The word hung in the air. A waitress. He said it the way people say something they consider beneath them. Garrett stood up slowly. He buttoned his jacket. It was a small gesture, but in that room, it carried the force of a gavel. She showed me something that 2 law firms, a financial advisory board, and my closest partner of 15 years either couldn't see or didn't want me to see. He paused. So yes, Vic, I'm taking her word. Sterling was already on the phone. I need a full corporate filing search on Caldwell Meridian Holdings, LLC. Registration date, officers, connected entities. The results came back in under an hour. Caldwell Meridian Holdings had been registered in Delaware 6 months ago. Sole officer, Victor Caldwell. Connected entities, 2 other LLCs, both linked to failed acquisitions in the past 4 years. 2 other companies, one in Philadelphia, one in Austin, had signed similar agreements. Both had lost controlling interest within 18 months. Victor Caldwell hadn't invented this trick. He'd perfected it. Sterling set his phone on the table. I'm calling the police. Victor didn't say a word. The police arrived at 9:14. 2 detectives, plain clothes. They walked into the private dining room like men who had done this before, which they had, because white-collar fraud in Manhattan wasn't a novelty. It was a Tuesday. Sterling met them at the door and handed over a printed summary, the contract clauses, the shell company registration, the 2 prior victims in Philadelphia and Austin. The detectives read it while standing. One of them made a phone call. The other looked at Victor Caldwell, who was sitting in his chair with his hands flat on the table, staring at the wall. Mr. Caldwell, the detective's voice was polite, professional. We'd like to ask you a few questions. Victor didn't look up. I want my lawyer. That's your right. But before we proceed, do you deny ownership of Caldwell Meridian Holdings, LLC? Victor's mouth opened. Then it closed. His jaw worked sideways, the way a man's jaw works when he's chewing on words he can't spit out. It was a drafting error, he said, but his voice had changed. The velvet was gone. What remained was thin and dry, like paper left in the sun too long. A drafting error that appeared in 3 separate contracts across 3 different companies over 4 years. The detective closed his notebook. We'll continue this downtown. They stood him up. Not roughly. They didn't need to. Victor Caldwell rose from the table where he had planned to steal a company, and he walked toward the door flanked by 2 detectives who treated him with the same professional courtesy they would offer anyone who had just been caught stealing $200 million. His pocket square was still perfect. His cufflinks still gleamed. But something behind his eyes had come apart. A mechanism that had been running smoothly for years, now grinding against itself. His shoes made no sound on the carpet. He held his wrists together in front of his body, even though no one had asked him to. At the door, Victor paused. He turned and looked at Hannah. She expected rage. She expected venom. She expected the kind of look that a man gives the person who destroyed his plan. What she saw was worse. It was disbelief. The genuine, bottomless disbelief of a man who had been outsmarted by someone he had never considered a threat. Not for a single second. He turned and walked out. The door closed behind him. The room exhaled. One of the corporate lawyers, The older one, the one who had been reading page 12 with his lips moving, leaned back in his chair and pressed both hands over his face. His partner sat beside him, staring at the contract as if it had grown teeth. Between them, they had billed 900 hours on this deal. 900 hours, and a waitress had found what they'd missed in 4 seconds over a soufflé plate. The board member, a woman named Catherine Holt, who had been silent the entire evening, spoke first. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "If she hadn't stopped you, Garrett, if that pen had touched the page, I know. You would have lost everything, the company, the board seats, the pension fund, all of it. I know, Catherine. Your granddaughter's trust, the foundation, 23 years of... I know." She stopped. She folded her napkin carefully, as though the act of creating order from linen could undo the chaos that had nearly swallowed them all. Then she looked at Hannah, with an expression that wasn't gratitude yet. It was closer to awe, the quiet, unsettling awe of a person who has just watched a building collapse next to them and is still processing the wind. The weight of it settled over the table like snow, silent, heavy, the kind of weight that makes breathing feel like work. Hannah stood by the sideboard. She hadn't moved since the police arrived. Her hands were clasped in front of her apron. Her left knee was trembling, and she couldn't make it stop. She had lost her job. She knew that with absolute certainty. The manager had said it in front of everyone. "You're done. You're fired." There was no taking that back. Tomorrow morning she would wake up at 5:40 to the same rattling alarm, but she would have one fewer place to go. Garrett walked over to her. He didn't rush. He crossed the room the way he had entered it earlier that evening. Slowly, deliberately, with the patience of a man who understands that some moments deserve their full weight. He stopped in front of Hannah and looked at her. Really looked. Not through her, not past her, at her. "How did you know?" he asked. Hannah swallowed. Her throat was dry. She thought about giving him the short answer, the technical answer, the one about clause structures and subordination language. But Garrett wasn't asking about the contract. She could see that in his eyes. He was asking about something else, something bigger. So she told him. She told him about the house in Jamaica, Queens, the one with the lemon tree that never produced lemons. She told him about her mother, Dorothy, who had been sharp and quick and proud, and who now lived in a facility in Queens and sometimes didn't remember her own daughter's name. She told him about Gerald Strauss and his blue tie, and his warm smile, and his 11-page addendum. About page 9, section D. About the subordination clause that looked routine until it activated and swallowed everything. She told him about NYU, about Dr. Aldridge, who said she had the sharpest eye he'd seen in 15 years. About the Friday afternoon she walked out of the registrar's office with a manila folder that said leave of absence, but meant something permanent. She told him about the diner. $11.50 an hour. $3 tips. She told him about La Maison d'Or, about being invisible, about reading supplier invoices in the break room because she couldn't stop herself from reading fine print the way some people can't stop themselves from checking locks. She told him about the phone call that afternoon. $4,800. 62 days past due. Discharge process. When she finished, the room was quiet again. But it was a different quiet. Not the shocked silence of the pen drop. This was the silence of people who have just heard something true. Garrett nodded. He nodded for a long time, the way a man nods when he's not agreeing but absorbing, processing, filing something away in a place where it will never be lost. Then he turned to the restaurant manager, who was standing in the doorway wringing his hands, his face a mask of professional regret. "You fired her," Garrett said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Ellison, the situation was... She put her hands on a guest, and our policy, she did what your entire staff, my lawyers, and my board couldn't do." Garrett's voice was level, measured, each word placed with the precision of a man who has spent decades choosing his words carefully. She paid attention. He looked at Hannah. "The people who see what others miss," he said. "They're worth everything." Hannah's left knee stopped trembling. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at the apartment in the South Bronx. It came in a heavy cream envelope, the kind that costs more to mail than Hannah's hourly wage at the diner. No return address on the outside, just her name, handwritten in black ink. She opened it at the kitchen counter, standing in the same spot where she ate granola bars in the dark. Inside was a single page on Ellison Foundation letterhead, 3 paragraphs, no legal jargon, no subordination clauses. The first paragraph informed her that a full academic scholarship had been established in her name at New York University, covering tuition, fees, books, and a living stipend for the remaining 3 semesters of her finance degree. The second paragraph offered her a paid position in the legal compliance division of Ellison Dynamics upon graduation. The role had been created specifically for her. It did not yet have a title because, the letter explained, Garrett wanted her to choose one. The third paragraph was shorter. It said that the outstanding balance at Greenfield Senior Living had been paid in full, and that her mother's care would be covered for the next 24 months through a private arrangement that required nothing from Hannah except her signature on a single form. She read the letter 3 times. She sat down on the kitchen floor and read it a 4th time, because her legs had stopped working. Lily found her there 20 minutes later, cross-legged on the linoleum, holding a piece of paper and crying without sound. "Mama, why are you on the floor?" "Because something good happened, baby." "Can I sit on the floor too?" "Yeah, come here." They sat together on the kitchen floor of a 3rd-floor apartment in the South Bronx, and Hannah held her daughter and let herself feel something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. Not the desperate kind, the kind you grip like a rope over a canyon. The quiet kind, the kind that sits down next to you and stays. 3 weeks after that, Hannah Irving walked through the doors of the NYU Stern School of Business for the first time in 3 years. The campus looked exactly the same. The trees along Washington Square had grown taller. She stopped at the entrance to the finance building and put her hand on the door handle. Cool metal. Familiar weight. In her bag, underneath a new laptop and a stack of fresh notebooks, was the old notebook from her junior year, the one with her notes on contract fraud, the one with Dr. Aldridge's comments in red pen in the margins. The pages were worn soft, but the words were still sharp. She opened the door and walked inside. Hannah Irving graduated from NYU Stern 18 months later, top of her class, Dean's List every semester. She crossed the stage in a black gown, diploma warm in her hands, and looked into the audience at a 4-year-old girl holding a sign that read, "That's my mama." She joined Ellison Dynamics the following Monday. Her title, the one she chose herself, was Director of Contract Integrity. Her office was on the 14th floor, 3 doors down from Garrett's. The nameplate on her door was brass. She touched it every morning on the way in. Within her first year, her team flagged 11 contractual irregularities across 3 pending acquisitions. 2 of them would have cost the company millions. But the work that mattered most didn't happen on the 14th floor. It happened on Saturday mornings, in a borrowed conference room at a community center in Jamaica, Queens. Folding tables, instant coffee, a box of pens. Hannah ran a free contract review clinic for low-income families, tenants, homeowners, anyone with a stack of papers and no one to explain what they meant. She called it the Dorothy Irving Project. Her mother still lived at Greenfield. Some days she remembered Hannah's name. Some days she didn't. But on the days she did, Hannah would sit beside her, hold her hand, soft now, thinner than she remembered, and tell her about the families they'd helped. Dorothy would squeeze her fingers and say, "That's my girl." If this story moved you, tell me. Have you ever seen someone do the right thing when it costs them everything? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.